Imagine coming home from World War I, hopeful for peace and prosperity, only to find your country gripped by a wave of paranoia so intense that neighbors turned on neighbors, immigrants were targeted for their beliefs, and the government jailed thousands without fair trials. This was America between 1919 and 1920, a period we now call the First Red Scare, a dark chapter where fear of communism and radicalism overshadowed the very freedoms the nation claimed to defend. To understand this moment, we must start with the world that set the stage for mass hysteria. The First World War ended in 1918, leaving America in a state of chaotic transition. Millions of soldiers returned home to a country struggling with inflation, food shortages, and rising unemployment. Factories that had produced weapons and supplies for the war suddenly scaled back, leaving workers without jobs and without hope. At the same time, the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia sent shockwaves across the globe. For the first time in modern history, a communist government had seized power, overthrowing the Tsar and promising a global workers' revolution. To wealthy business owners, politicians, and many middle-class Americans, this was not just a foreign event. It was a threat to capitalism, private property, and the American way of life itself. Compounding this fear was a wave of labor unrest that swept the nation in 1919. More than 4 million workers went on strike that year, demanding better wages, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. The Seattle General Strike shut down the entire city for 5 days in February. The Boston police strike left the city unprotected and led to widespread chaos. And the nationwide steel strike involved over 350,000 workers. Instead of addressing these legitimate economic grievances, many employers and government officials labeled all labor activists as communists, anarchists, or Bolshevik agents. They claimed that these strikes were not about fair pay. They were part of a secret plot to overthrow the U.S. government. This lie turned economic frustration into political fear, laying the groundwork for the Red Scare. The spark that turned fear into full-blown panic came in 1919, with a series of coordinated anarchist bombings. In April, dozens of package bombs were mailed to prominent politicians, judges, and business leaders across the country. One bomb exploded at the home of Georgia Senator Thomas W. Hardwick, injuring his housekeeper. A quick-thinking postal worker in New York City intercepted 16 more bombs before they could reach their targets, including oil magnate John D. Rockefeller then. On June 2, 1919, bombs exploded simultaneously in 8 major cities. The most shocking attack targeted the home of U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer in Washington, D.C. The bomber, an anarchist named Carlo Valdinocci, died instantly when the bomb detonated early. The blast damaged Palmer's house and shook the home of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, who lived across the street. This attack turned a Mitchell Palmer into the face of the Red Scare. An ambitious politician, with his eyes on the 1920 presidential election, Palmer saw the bombings as a chance to gain national fame by fighting the radical threat. He created a new division within the Justice Department called the General Intelligence Division, led by a young ambitious official named J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover spent months building files on thousands of suspected radicals, communists, anarchists, and labor activists, laying the foundation for what would later become the FBI. Palmer and Hoover claimed they had evidence of a massive communist conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government, and they promised to protect America from this imaginary danger. In November 1919, Palmer launched the first wave of what became known as the Palmer Raids. Federal agents, often without search warrants or arrest warrants, stormed meeting halls, union offices, and private homes in cities across the country. They targeted immigrants, especially those from Russia, Eastern Europe, and Italy, assuming that anyone with a foreign accent was a radical. Over 10,000 people were arrested in these raids. Most were held for days or weeks, without access to lawyers, without being charged with a crime, and without a fair hearing. Many were beaten or mistreated while in custody. On December 21, 1919, 249 people, including famous anarchist activists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, were loaded onto a ship called the Buford and deported to Russia. The press called this vessel the Soviet Ark, and the deportation was celebrated as a victory against radicalism, even though most of those expelled had committed no crimes other than holding unpopular political beliefs. The Palmer raids reached their terrifying peak on January 2, 1920. In a single night, federal agents raided 33 cities in 23 states, arresting more than 4,000 people. Communist Party offices, labor union headquarters, and immigrant community centers were ransacked. People were arrested simply for attending a meeting, reading a radical newspaper, or having foreign-born friends. Most of those arrested were ordinary workers, immigrants, and political activists, not violent revolutionaries. Legal experts, including future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, condemned the raids as unconstitutional, arguing that they violated the Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and the Fifth Amendment's right to due process. But at the time, most Americans supported the raids, terrified by the constant media warnings of a communist takeover. The Red Scare did not just affect those arrested or deported. It spread into every corner of American life. States passed criminal syndicalism laws that made it illegal to advocate for industrial strikes or radical political change. Universities fired professors who expressed left-wing views. Libraries banned books that promoted socialism or anarchism. And ordinary people lost their jobs if they were suspected of having radical beliefs. Immigrants faced growing discrimination, and Congress later passed strict immigration laws that heavily restricted people from Southern and Eastern Europe, partly in response to the anti-immigrant sentiment of the Red Scare. Even free speech, a cornerstone of American democracy, was severely limited. People were arrested for giving speeches that criticized the government or supported labor rights under the 1917 Espionage Act and 1918 Sedition Act. By early 1920, however, the tide began to turn. Palmer, desperate to maintain public support and boost his presidential campaign, made a bold and disastrous prediction. He announced that communists would launch a violent revolution across America on May 1, 1920, International Workers' Day. He ordered police and federal agents to prepare for riots, bombings, and assassinations. Newspapers across the country warned citizens to stay indoors and fear the worst. But May 1, 1920 came and went peacefully. There were no revolutions, no bombings, no mass uprisings. The day was completely normal. This failed prediction exposed Palmer's fear-mongering as a lie. The public realized that the communist threat had been wildly exaggerated, and that the Palmer raids had destroyed civil liberties to fight a danger that barely existed. Newspapers that had once praised Palmer now criticized his unconstitutional tactics. Judges began dismissing cases against those arrested in the raids, and many people were released from jail. The Red Scare quickly faded away as Americans turned their attention to economic growth and the prosperity of the 1920s. Still, the first Red Scare left a permanent mark on American history. It established the precedent of using national security fears to limit civil liberties, a pattern that would repeat during the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism in the 1950s. It created a culture of suspicion toward immigrants and political dissent that lasted for generations. It also formalized federal domestic surveillance as J. Edgar Hoover used the tools he built during the Red Scare to lead the FBI for nearly 50 years, targeting political activists and marginalized groups. Most importantly, it teaches us a vital lesson: when fear replaces reason, even the strongest democracies can abandon the freedoms they claim to protect. The first Red Scare was not just a moment in time, it was a test of America's commitment to its own values. A test that in many ways the nation failed. It reminds us that the greatest threats to democracy are not always from foreign enemies, but sometimes from our own willingness to sacrifice liberty for the illusion of safety. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel.